So today we are fortunate to have Joshua Patenaude, who does not go by JoJo, but has been called Otter in the past. And he works in Erin Heary's lab at Western, and she will be coming to talk with us next year, actually. And Josh did his undergraduate degree with master, and his master's degree at San Houston State, which is outside of Texas, outside of Houston, near Huntsville, which is where the death penalty is executed, no pun intended, in Texas, and is one of the winners of the Sea Kings, the Allison Award, which is given out by the Division of Development and Disabilities Program for research for students in doing research in the area. And so today, Josh is going. This is your part of your PhD thesis.
Yes, yeah. The law of research will encompass my thesis.
Fantastic. You're going to be talking about social cognition learning and the relationships in autism spectrum. So, thank you and welcome.
So thank you for everyone for having me. And if you draw my talk, you'll actually draw my supervisors when she talks about trust and smiles a lot more. She'll dive into some of the stuff I'm working in a lot more next year. So I guess that's a bit of part two almost. So first, I kind of like to start off with a few questions to get a feel for the audience and get some feedback. So first, who here has like interacted socially with an individual who's high-functioning individual with autism spectrum disorder?
What do you mean by interactive social?
So like just have a conversation, talking to at some point in time, like versus like a clinical setting, just having a casual conversation, or yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody, pretty much everybody,
Casual conversation.
Why are you pointing
Because
at me?
you get a lot of casual conversation in your assessments.
Oh, okay.
It's not always standardized and formal.
Okay, so
That's your point.
So then a follow-up question. When you're having these conversations with these individuals, just feel free to shout out, but like kind of what were the first word impressions when you get from these individuals?
Awkward.
Awkward, okay. Anything else? Or is that sum it up perfect? That's like that single word, just incorporates everything perfectly.
One-sided.
Yeah. Sometimes they're informative. I've learned a lot about washing machines and fans.
Okay, so you like,
Vacuums, what vacuums don't divide.
Okay, so great. So you have a lot of things, but they're kind of all falling under, yes, kind of that very first word, sharing out awkward social interaction. So I'll give you a little bit of experience that I have with just kind of interacting with these individuals in general society. I am a bit of a board game geek, so that's kind of what I do for my hobbies. So I have a bunch of different board game groups, but one of them is actually I go to a board game store in downtown London, and when I get there, you talk to the other people, you make friends there. And when I opened up about a bit of what I did research in, some of the individuals actually told me that they were individuals who were high functioning and had autism spectrum disorder, but a lot of them actually were family members of people who had this disorder, and they were like like brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers. And they actually told me part of the reason why they were at these board game stores was they used board games as a good bonding opportunity with these individuals. So maybe if they had trouble bonding with them from like your standard social interactions and your typical kind of hobbies, board games they found a really good way to cope and form a connection. And so board games are pretty interesting because unlike general social interactions, board games, if we don't talk about the social deduction board games, are very structured and have a very strict set of rules. And when it comes around to your turn, you do a set action and then it moves on. So one of the interesting things about this, and I'll just kind of give you an example, is like Ticket to Ride, if anyone's familiar with that board game. Essentially, when it's your turn, you get to do one action. And those actions are either, it's a Ticket to Ride, it's a train game, so you're trying to build rails that your trains can be on. So you can either draw a train ticket, you can either build a rail if you have enough train cars to build a rail, or you can pull a destination card, which is essentially another action that can get you points at the end of the game, and you're trying to earn as many points as possible. But this is very rigid. You do one of those actions, you choose, then you pass your turn on. This is very simple, very structured, very straightforward. And that's often the type of games that these individuals would talk to me about, saying this is the types of games that they play with their sibling or child. And just to kind of really drive home the point, the difference between these structured board games and a general kind of social interaction full of different contexts, I'm going to ask you guys some questions. So I'm just going to pop up on the screen and just answer as quickly as possible what you think the answer is. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, you're all math experts here. Good to know. So this next one, what happens is the next thing that pops up on the screen, what I want you to do is just imagine what the context could be. Pull up a picture in your head of what this next sentence might be. So, the men watched as the chest was opened. So, I'll give you a couple seconds. What could this possibly mean?
Pirates have recovered a treasure chest and the men are watching the leader open it.
All right. So,
Heart
yeah,
surgery.
and so exactly this. So, okay, so who thought the pirates? So we at least had a couple people with pirates, and then who thought the heart surgery? who actually thought something totally different? I mean, like, was there any third options here? Okay, so what was interesting about this is, without some sort of surrounding context around this, both of these are perfectly reasonable conclusions to come to. But unlike the math question, what's 1 + 1 is always going to be 2, unless we get into quantum stuff, but we're not going to go there. There are multiple options for this linguistical statement. And if you have sentences before and after, it might help clarify. But for the sake of just the sentence alone, it's a little bit ambiguous. Both of these are acceptable. And this doesn't just apply to the linguistical component of social interactions, but also, well, basically every part of social interactions, all that nonverbal body language and paralinguistic tones. So giving another example from kind of a social realm, if I were to say, oh, nice shirt, that sounds like a compliment. One would interpret that as a positive valence. Oh, I have a nice shirt. Now, if I say those exact same words, but I use the term, oh, nice shirt, that doesn't have that same positive valence. The words alone, if you strip it, you would assume, okay, nice shirt implies something good. But in the context of the way I said it, they take on totally different meanings. Now, the fact kind of everybody's nodding their head, okay, that makes perfect sense, we all get it. So why are we able to quickly grasp these different social contexts? You know, we both understood both these are relative, both these are applicable. Now, why are we able to do this? Well, one of the reasons we're able to do this is we have tons of experience. And we have tons of experience because right from the get-go, the moment we're kind of brought into this world, we're in an environment surrounded by these social things. We have many, many hours of experience grasping this. The average person is quite an expert in the social realm. I mean, we're all social experts here. And it's not just the fact that we're in a social environment from basically the moment of our birth, but it's also that we're learning in these social environments from the get-go. So to really iterate this point, there was a very interesting study where they brought in infants into a lab at 3 months old, sat them down with the parents, and what they did was they played each home, and then they blew air in these infants' faces, and the infants would blink. So essentially, this was an associative learning task where they tried to see how many trials it took for infants to associate the noise, tone, with the air blast. So the moment the infant started blinking before the air blast was applied, the infants had learned this contingency. Now, the really interesting part about this is the downstream when they tested at 9 months later at 1 year old. So 1 year old infants, they were found there's an association between how fast they learned the associative learning task and how fast they picked up on social contingencies and engaged in social behaviors at 1 year old, and for when they were 1 year old. So those who learn quicker at 3 months old also learn social contingencies and social behaviors faster at a 1 year old. And so now think about the implications of this. So if we think about possible trajectories for these individuals. So say you were a child who was a really fast learner and you picked up on everything at 3 months old, and then you're really engaging in social behaviors at 1 year old. Imagine what they look like at 5 and 12 years old. At 5 years old, and kind of around like kindergarten-ish age, they're probably, kind of not so much tied to the parent, probably going out exploring that social world, interacting with other small children, kind of maybe making some friends. At 12 years old, you can imagine these individuals, if they're really picking up from social cues and learning social interactions really quickly, they might be like the popular kids in class. They might, have a large group of social friends. They might be, really thriving in this type of environment. Now imagine a slightly slower learner. This learner struggles a bit more to pick up on these cues and picks up a little bit less social contingencies when they're at that 1 year old point. At 5 years old, they might be a little bit more hesitant to get into the social environment, may make less friends, and at 12 years old, they might still be in the same environment, but maybe they only have like a core group of friends and they kind of stick to themselves a little bit more introverted, if you call it. You kind of saw them and just observe them. However, take into consideration an individual that is later diagnosed as a high-functioning individual with autism spectrum disorders. If they also display this pattern of slower learning, but if the high-learning individual has a trajectory like this, And the slower learning individual has a trajectory like this, but eventually catches up with the higher, faster learner because, in general society, we're all more or less pretty decent. Imagine the individuals that never quite catches up with them and they never quite meet that same level. If we think about it like that, when they get to that 5 years old, they might not be in the same environment, they might be very withdrawn, and they might not even get to that same 12-year-old status of being in a standard classroom. They might be removed from the classroom for special learning programs. They might have extremely limited friends and or struggle with general social interactions. So that then puts them on a totally different learning trajectory. And we know that the educational system is a very social world. I mean, as much as we like to try to make this equal as possible for everybody, there's a bunch of students in the classroom, the teacher's talking, there's a lot of things to pick up from it, and there's many different subjects. If you struggle in that environment, you're then going to struggle in the educational system in general. So now we're looking at a totally different trajectory for these individuals. And if we have that, that might help explain some of the kind of standard behaviors one sees in these individuals in the clinical population. So, some kind of the iconic symptoms in these individuals and traits. In social interactions, eye gazes. These individuals typically engage in less eye gazes than others, non-clinical groups. In joint attention, if I suddenly look to the side, one typically follows. These individuals are far less likely to engage in that behavior. And then we move on to, there we go. We kind of move on to the communication. So paralinguistic cues, as I brought up previously. If you interpret the words "oh, nice shirt" as always positive because you're not looking at the context, then that you might be in for some vaguely rude surprises when the person's not actually commenting your shirt, or making a sarcastic remark where they actually might be complimenting you. If you don't pick that up and you only interpret it as negatively, you're kind of missing the boat on that, and that can result in awkward social interactions. In addition, now there's different interpretations for this literature, mind you, but some of the literature suggests that there's like more flat affect and on measures of like EQ, empathy quotient, there's been reports of lower empathy, self-reported empathy in these individuals. Again, there's a few different ways to interpret that, but that's just what some of the literature says about this. So there's not only literature looking at clinical population versus non-clinical, there's also a lot of research done in just the general population. So the DSM, I'm sure you're all aware, reclassified autism, so there's the autism spectrum disorder, spectrum being the critical word here. It's full spectrum, and the general population, we're all sitting somewhere on that, whether we're on the higher ends or the lower ends, everybody's on there somewhere. And that's actually the population I looked at in a lot of my research. Now, there's a few reasons for this. One is because, kind of as I mentioned, those different trajectories. Whether you are a high, like a quick learner, from childhood and picking up on all the social cues, or you're a slower learner, you all pretty much enter the school system in a similar way. You're all going through those same social experiences, more or less. You're all grades like 1 to 9, you go to high school, and then you kind of do whatever past there. But that early formative years, they're all very similar. However, individuals who are diagnosed with ASDs, they don't necessarily have those same trajectories. So then we start getting into what's actually causing some of these effects. Is it because of the symptoms, or is it because they were pulled out of these environments and put into unique environments, where they undergo like applied behavioral training and so on and so forth. But that's very different. That's not the same thing as somebody going into a classroom and interacting with their peers. So there's that concern. In addition, there's also the concern of comorbidity. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea that individuals with ASDs typically don't just have an autism spectrum disorder, but they also have other comorbid disorders, quite common, for like depression, social anxiety disorder, general anxiety disorder. These are just some I'm listing, but there's several others that have been associated in research with this. And by looking at the general population, while some individuals still have some of these disorders, this is at a far lower rate. And they also, since they're non-clinical groups, they don't have potential concerns with interacting issues, such like that the idea of like there might be a interaction between, for example, depression and ASD that's causing some of the results being found in the literature. It's very hard to tweeze that out. So by looking at the general population, we can avoid that problem. Okay. So how did we look at the general population? How did we classify these individuals as essentially what we did was like higher autistic-like symptoms or lower autistic-like symptoms. So we used the Autism Spectrum Quotient by Simon Baron Cohen. This is a really, really popular scale used in a lot of the literature to look at general population individuals and in addition also some clinical populations. It's been validated in clinical populations. But what this scale is a self-report measure that asks individuals, whether they endorse or do not endorse certain statements. And essentially what it breaks down to is there's 5 subscales and about, do you endorse these autistic-like traits or do you not? And so the 5 subscales that break down, essentially we look at social skills. One question is, I find it hard to make new friends. So social skills are essentially like, are you putting yourself out into those social environments to gain those social experiences? That's the type of questions, I prefer going to parties than libraries, so on and so forth. Communication is another subscale. I enjoy social chit chat. This is like, do you use your tools, your social tools appropriately when engaging in these conversations? So, there's questions like, I never stop when it's appropriate in conversations, where people find me going on and on about a specific topic for long periods of time. And these are 2 we're really focused on as we figure, if these are the social components, and they kind of make up what a social interaction system, we should see lots of differences in these between high trait individuals and low trait individuals. But however, we also look at the 3 following subscales: attention to detail, I notice patterns and things all the time. So this is really kind of looking into like local processes, really looking to the fine details rather than seeing the big picture. Attention switching, I frequently get so strongly absorbed in one thing that I lose sight of other things. So that a difficulty switching from one task to another, task switching. Then imagination, I find making up stories easy. It's often found in small children, individuals who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. They, lack or usually don't engage as much in like imaginary play. They have a hard time like fantasizing, less likely to have imaginary friends. So this would be a reverse code scheme. So if you endorse this, then you do not endorse a trait of like an ASD-like trait. So this is what we use for all our studies. So when I reference whether high or low ASD-like symptoms, this is what I'm referencing. Also, just kind of as a preface for some things I'll mention later, we have very large sample sizes. So our high AQ individuals are pretty high on the AQ, and our low AQ individuals are very low in the AQ. So we have quite a large spread. These are very significantly different individuals. So now that we have our groups, our first question is, we just want to see, are there any even differences in the general population that we can tweeze out between high trait individuals and low trait individuals? And this is the first thing we need to establish. Are there any differences? And what's the easiest way to figure out these differences? If we're looking to see if there's social differences, put them in a social interaction. So just have them come in, and this is what we did, we had them come in and have unscripted social interactions. So we just let 2 participants sit in a room together, we recorded it, and they just talked to each other. We didn't give them any questions because there's a lot of research methodology concerns about giving people scripted questions. We just let them talk about whatever. I can kind of tell you, most people had this typical get-to-know-you conversation. So, how is London? Do you like it here? What are your hobbies? How's the weather? How are you in general? These type of questions is mostly what was asked. And, some people, they have some hobbies hit it off, and so on and so forth. After that conversation, what they did was they kind of went their separate ways. Then they filled out a short questionnaire. And in this questionnaire, it had 2 main components to it. It had a component essentially asking people how much they like their partner. So all the questions kind of similarly in that theme of likability. Then there was another series of questions that fell essentially under the theme of social comfort, like conversation quality, essentially. And so this was basically, were there awkward pauses in the conversation? Was your partner socially awkward? Was it just generally uncomfortable for you to experience it? So what we were interested in was not necessarily what they said, but what their partner said about them. So an individual who endorsed low level of traits versus an individual who endorsed high level of traits, were their partners rating them different? So this is the real question. First, we've got to establish this. Okay, so first what we did was we kind of split up the sections of the AQ into all the non-social components, then we looked at social. So for likability, we found no significant correlation. This is essentially very close to a flat line. All these skills, as one would expect, don't really relate to the likability of this other the part of their rating.
So this, the AQ score was for the person doing the rating?
So this is like if you were sitting in 2 chairs, your partner would rate you. And so essentially what this means is that If there was a significant correlation, like I'm about to get to, so I'll just kind of show it here. What this would mean is that the more you endorse autistic-like traits when it comes to social skills and communication subskills, the less you're liked by your partner. So,
Okay, so it's my rating of my own.
so no, this is the partner's rating of
Your rating of your own autism traits and your
Yeah.
partner's rating
Of
of
you.
how much they like
Yeah,
you.
right.
So yeah, these are your own traits. So if you're scoring higher, and this is what your partner thinks of you. So in this case, there was a very significant correlation here in that, again, the more your partner rated, like essentially the less they liked you, or vice versa. The more traits you endorse, the less they liked you. So
Did you look at how much people, their ratings on these scales related to their own rating of the other
yeah, so
person's
there,
likability?
so there was, so like for example, if they were really high AQ, there wasn't any specific thing changing how they liked it. So eventually, if you put like two high AQ individuals or high trait individuals together, they still found the conversation like, I don't like my partner as much. So like, in two low trait people, reported that they really liked each other. So it's, reciprocal essentially. And if you had a high and a low, so on and so forth. It was just, the predictor was the partner's rating of you. So if you displayed more of these traits, your partner liked you.
It was a random sample of students or people?
Yeah, so this first sample kind of gathered from both Western students and general population. So we also had, like businessmen and women coming in and, some like investors or just, also some just like accountants, kind of just local Western or sort of local London populace also coming in here some of the time. So mixed sample.
But each person only saw one other person.
Yes.
Interesting, because there's all kinds of things that can affect likability. They're
Yes.
not just somebody's. So if you had a MAGA supporter and a Bernie Sanders supporter in the same room talk to each other, I mean, regardless of their scores on the autism quotient, they might not really like each other.
Fair enough. However, again, these were get to know you conversations, so that wasn't really like, people weren't asking you kind of looked at the videos, people weren't asking the tough questions like, what are your stances on, right to bear arms, or, are you a free speech advocate or not? They were legitimately like very shallow, just casual things. Again, what are your hobbies? And everyone said safe things. People weren't getting into fights by the end of these. Again, this was very much that you've just met a stranger for the first time. These are your first impressions. You're asking some simple questions. The only time, people ever really hit it off was if they shared similar hobbies. But yeah, no real deep stuff was really explored in these conversations. We also looked at the, so kind of moving on, we also looked at partner interaction quality. So there's no significant interaction here, or sorry, no correlations here. We have a significant correlation here, again, on the social skills and communication subscales. So the more traits you endorsed, the less your partners felt comfortable in that social interaction. Now, the one thing to note is, unlike in this, between these two, there was statistical significance between these two. So this was significantly less than this. While this correlation was significant, there was no significant, it was, hair's breadth away from significance, but there was no significant difference between these two scales. So there's an effect here, but it's a smaller one, just to note. But what we can take away from this is that there are subtle behavioral differences that are being picked up here in some way. If you are reporting these higher traits in social and communication subscales, your partner is taking away that they typically like you less, and they also typically find the interaction more awkward and more difficult to navigate through. No, we also ran several other questionnaires with these individuals, so we did look at things like controlling for extroversion and stuff like that. So this is with that control. So now that we can see that there are behavioral differences here in these groups, what's causing them? Because it's nice to know that they do exist in the general population, is displaying these differences between the high trait individuals and low trait individuals, but what's driving them? So, that's kind of the million-dollar question. And this, then we have to dive into some of the previous research and some suggestions they give. However, we want to root kind of things in this idea of the earlier study that finds that children who learn faster pick up social traits faster. So we wanted to look into the literature of learning and different learning mechanisms that could be at play here. Because this is this idea of you're a better learner, you pick up better social skills, you interact at a later date better. So one of the things, the first things we looked into was this idea of response bias or reward sensitivity. So to give you an idea of what this means, just imagine every day your rewards to social and non-social rewards. So one of the examples I gave is traffic. It is very punishing to get caught up in traffic. Nobody likes that. And heaven forbid you're on the 401 and you get stuck in there for hours. However, it's really rewarding when you hit the roads just at the right time and it's smooth sailing. You save yourself tons of time. Now imagine you have two different routes to get to a location that you take regularly, and you always turn on the radio and it always tells you which one is traffic, which one doesn't have traffic. But then one day you're in such a rush, you miss the radio station and there's that turn, and you have to make a choice immediately, but you don't know which one is going to, punish you or reward you. Now, if in previous experiences, the one road about 60% of the time was clear of traffic, and the other road was only clear of traffic about 40% of the time, so you took 140, 160, in that split second of ambiguity, you're going to go to that 60% time road because you're going to kind of hedge your bets unconsciously. If you have time consciously, but if you're literally kind of at the turnpike and you have to make the swing, you're going to do it just off the top of your head, and that's a response bias form. That's your preference for one over the other, consciously or unconsciously. We wanted to see if we could capture that, and if this idea of forming a response bias and reward sensitivity, that is different between high trait individuals and low trait individuals. And the research has suggested this, that there should be this difference such that individuals who are high trait individuals, they should display a slower response bias or lesser response bias formation than individuals who are low trait, especially when using social rewards. So how do we go about doing this? Well, the best way to display that is actually to test you guys with a few trials. So what participants saw, so I'll basically show you what participants would see, more or less. What they do is they would see a almost complete face, and a line would show up representing the mouth in the center. And the line would be either long or short. Now, no, this task is supposed to be quite difficult. So these are pretty similar in length. In addition, when the face pops up on the screen, the mouth pops up later and only pops up for 100 milliseconds. So we're talking, boom, flash, gone. And then they had to make a choice about whether it was long or short. And this is done over and over and over and over and over again. And they're told, if they make the correct choice, they will sometimes be rewarded, told that they were correct, some of the time. If they make the incorrect choice, they will never be told they'll never be told they're wrong. So if you are told you're right, well, you're definitely right. But if you don't get any feedback, you could have been right, you could have been wrong. Okay, so that's what they're told. So let's go through this and kind of help you guys run through this. So, okay, ready? All right. Long. Okay, great. It was long. You are correct. Okay, next one. Ready?
Short.
Okay.
Long.
Okay, good. It was long.
Long.
Right.
Short.
Okay, good. Now, as this trial goes on and on, you're not going to be able to get every single one right, because also I gave you a little bit of space between them. Typically, the task is just back to back to back to back. And there's reasons why you might not be able to always know what the line is. For one, you might legitimately blink. You might be slowly phasing out of attention. Not every participant's perfect. Or, legitimately, you might have stared at that and you've been seeing so many long and short, you're unable to figure out which one it was. Now, unbeknownst to the participants is that we don't reward each line equally. Just like when you were engaged in this task, I told you you were right and good job if you got the long lines, but when you all correctly guessed the short, I said nothing. So they got asymmetric rewards from this task in that the long line, or it was randomized between participants, but one of the lines would be rewarded far more often than the other. So when participants were unsure of the selection they were making, if they inherently chose the line that was more rewarded, so as the blocks go on, they're developing response bias, the more they chose that more rewarded line over the less rewarded line in times of ambiguity, that's the development of a response bias. So essentially you can kind of look at that when they're making misses and they're choosing the incorrect line, they're always choosing one preference to one line over the other. That's how that works. And so that's how we calculated that. It's actually a formula I can go over if you're interested, but it's for later. And so let's look at some of the results. So the formation over time. So we're kind of really mostly interested in this block 3, kind of where do they end up with the response bias. So here's how the low AQ groups performed. So, I mean, the task worked. That's always reassuring. As a researcher, you didn't waste your time and money. So as blocks went on, they developed more of a response bias. And some monetary feedback. So there'd be one participants who would complete both conditions. One condition would be when they got feedback, they would be, congratulations, you earned like 3 cents. And the other condition, it would be a smiley face that would come back at them. And otherwise, they both complete both conditions, and here's the results. Then, so and also there's social feedback, they develop response bias by the third block. Okay.
So
Again,
what's the response bias again? What does the
so
numbers mean?
when you're not sure what line essentially popped up, if you're gearing towards one over the other. So if you are choosing to respond, make your response the more rewarded line. So if the long line, for example, is rewarded more often, and you're not sure between the two, much just like in traffic, if you're unsure which route to take, you will choose the more rewarding route. You will choose the more rewarding line. And that's that development. The quicker you develop it, or just the greater degree you develop it, this means that there's more of a response bias. So,
But a negative number means that,
greater response bias. So greater towards the richly rewarded line.
but that's a negative number?
Yes, that's a negative number in this case. Positive number would be towards the mean or less rewarded line. So this is the proper formation. You are developing a response bias in the way one would expect. Okay, and so we're kind of really looking at this third block here is the main thing. So we should see if the literature is correct, we would expect to see large differences in this task as been shown by previous literature. Here's what we got. Okay, if we're looking at the third blocks, that's identical. We're looking at the third blocks, again, variance, like this is almost identical in variance. And so overall, we actually don't see a difference in the response bias by the end of this task. Now, there are some other interesting things in this data, but I'll talk about that if you have questions later. But the main takeaway from this thing is that by the end of the task, the response bias that's formed is about equal strength across both groups for social and non-social conditions. Their performance is equal. And this isn't what previous literature says. So why might that be? Well, just like how everybody makes, their own kind of way, we did things a little bit differently in our task. What we did was, so in this literature, there's for some reason, and I can't quite figure it out, always a really small sample size. So in clinical samples, I can understand why these populations are not always the biggest to get a hold of. But even in non-clinical samples using general populations, we're talking like sample sizes between, like, if you include kind of the clinical and the group, you have some studies with a small sample size that's like 10 and as large as like 50. I think there's like one with like 67 out there. Our sample was 150 people. So in those familiar with statistical power, you need to get to a certain number of people essentially run in an experiment to actually reduce your chances of having erroneous results essentially pop up and say it's significant when it's not really. So we had a much larger sample size than any previous study run in this type in the reward sensitivity literature looking at these groups. In addition, we're one of the very few studies that actually use a double-blind methodology. So we don't know what participants are when they come in. The computer is what scores them. When they come in, they complete a series of questionnaires, and one of them is the AQ. We just give them the instructions, and we let them go. In previous studies, the experimenters bringing them in know exactly what they are. And as several studies recently been published, actually one including my supervisor, even in simple studies, you can have massive experimenter bias. If they know what group, and they know what group you fit in, that can very, very, very easily skew results in one way or the other. So we made sure we would not engage in that. We did not want to risk that. So those are two really big differences this study has compared to previous literature. Now, okay, maybe we don't have too much going on here, but there's still a large swath of learning literature out there. And some of the other stuff we dived into, I'm about to explain, actually has more support for it. It's this idea of...
So about when you gave people the money, did you say, congratulations, good job, here's your money?
You should be like, congrats, you have earned 3 cents, and then the next child would immediately pop up.
But is congratulations a social reward?
So that's kind of an associate. So in the literature, any sort of positive wording or money isn't considered a social reward. Now, that is definitely I will 100% agree with you that there is a conversation to be had about what is social rewards, and I'll kind of actually touch on that a little bit at the end of the talk, because there is a There's a wide variety of things people call social and non-social in the literature, and that's up for debate. But I'll say that to the end. I have a lot to say about that, actually. But there's a lot. So there's a lot in the literature about this learning from unreliable feedback. And to kind of give you an example of this and how this kind of might play out in the real world, on a day-to-day basis. So my brother will come to me and ask me, does he look good in his outfit? Which I'm terrible taste of clothes, so I don't know why he asks me. But I will always tell him accurately. If he looks good, I'll always tell him, you look good in your suit or whatever. If he looks terrible because he's got mismatched socks and he's worn the wrong color shirt and pants, I'll also always tell him, you don't look great. So that's reliable feedback I'm giving him. I'm always telling him the truth. Now with my fiance, things are a little bit differently. If she looks great, yeah, I'll tell her. She looks great, excellent outfit. If she's chosen a unique designer choice for the day, I will also tell her she made a great choice. That feedback is not reliable. Maybe it's kind of reliable mostly for when it is good and good, but when it's interesting, I am inaccurately giving feedback. I am telling her it is good when in reality there's a different, more objective answer. And so that's kind of the reliability. We get that in the world. Not everybody knows the entire idea of little white lies. This is unreliable feedback. People might tell you things and that's not actually how they play out. So there's literature here that suggests that in kind of these reliable, unreliable tasks, they're called probabilistic selection tasks, individuals who display higher traits, more autism spectrum disorder traits, they struggle to learn when the feedback is very probabilistic or very unreliable in nature. So you're kind of getting a lot of that white lies kind of popping in there, telling you you're right when you're wrong or wrong when you're right. That really confuses them. So it's more difficult for everybody to learn, but the literature suggests this is where these individuals really struggle to learn. Now, that's quite interesting, and that kind of makes sense in the overall picture of, since the social interactions aren't always reliable, if you struggle to learn from feedback that isn't always reliable, maybe that's why you struggle in social interactions. Okay, we got a theory, good research behind it, it makes sense. Let's give it a go. So here's how we tested it. Once the person sat down in the lab, they would then complete a series of questionnaires, again the AQ, and then they would move on to the tasks. And what happens is they would sit down and they'd be instructed to use trial and error feedback, or trial and error learning, to learn which image out of any given pair that appears on the screen, and several different pairings will appear on the screen, figure out which one gives good feedback the most often. So there are several different pairs, and all the images in the pairs are randomized across participants, so everybody gets different combinations of images. But any given pair will always stay the same for a participant. By that I mean, if this participant, say you're a participant, and you see this cherry rabbit pairing, this cherry rabbit pairing will always remain this pairing for you for this condition. So this is what they experience then. You sit down, you're like, okay, I think the cherry's right. So you'll select the cherry, a frame pops around it to indicate their choice, and then you are given feedback. So in this task, you were always given feedback. In this case, they got feedback telling them they're right, green check mark. And then, say some other pairings go by, and then this pairing pops up again. So you want to explore. Maybe it's the rabbit. What happens if you select the rabbit? Okay, now you get feedback telling you you're wrong. In this case, a red X. So this is one condition that person's completed. Feedback. It's non-social, so they received it, they were correct, green check marks or red X's. But they didn't just run this task with non-social feedback, they also ran this task again with social feedback. And just to clarify, for research purposes, the order that these were presented were randomized to control for any sort of effect that might occur. So in the social feedback, what they received was either they were correct, smiles from the experimenter, or frowns from the experimenter. Myself here is the easiest to represent. And this we thought had value to these individuals as they had interacted with the experimenter. They were the ones who gave them the instructions, and then go into the lab, and they will meet this individual at a later date. So there should be some value from this person's smile and this person's frown, someone that they've been acquainted with. But it wasn't only feedback type that was varied. It was probability of, reliability, unreliability of the feedback. So we had the first condition, which is a 100-0, in that they always received reliable feedback. So the chance of receiving reliable feedback was 100%. Every time you made the correct choice, you were told you made the correct choice. Every time you made the incorrect choice, you were told you made the incorrect choice. However, there were 3 conditions where there was a certain amount of unreliable feedback in it, and these varied. So we have 3 conditions of increasing difficulty: 80-20, 70-30, 60-40. So just to give you an idea, in the case of 80-20, 80% of the time you receive reliable feedback, correct when correct, incorrect when incorrect, but 20% of the time you receive invalid feedback, so that when you're correct, you'd be told you're wrong, or if you're actually wrong, you'd be told you're correct, so the feedback is not accurate. This obviously gets more difficult across the tasks, and then with the most difficult being 60-40. Any more difficult would be 50-50, which is perfect chance, and there's no learning that can occur during random chance. Okay, so this is the pairs, and the pairs are either given feedback in a social or non-social condition. Again, if the literature is correct, what we would expect to see is a difference between that high and low traits. Lower trait individuals who report higher autism spectrum disorder traits should really struggle in these tasks, but especially struggle in the 60-40 condition. Okay, what do we actually see? Okay, here's what the low AQ group looks like. So, great, our task worked. They became more challenging over time for these individuals. Again, we didn't waste our time and our money paying people. The task is good. And how about the high group? Okay, exactly the same performance, like down to the T. Not what one would expect in this case. This is interesting. Now, I will expand a bit more on this in a second, but there's no significant differences in performance between these groups. Between high and low, we have exactly identical performance. Now, what happens though if we're looking at the wrong piece of the puzzle? So it's not just this unreliability and feedback that goes on, but there's also this reliability of the environment. Remember, you do an action, you get feedback, but what happens if the environment itself that's giving you this information? What is it that's the unreliable thing that's driving this? So, to give you an idea about this, here's an example. So, say you take 2 households. Household A, household B. The kid in household A, his family is on the up and up, and every day his dad comes home and gives him a hug. So he waits at the door, his dad reliably will come home and give him a hug and then go about his day. Also, the kid is part of a soccer club. Every Wednesday, he knows that his mom is going to pick him up after school and take him to the soccer club. His mom always comes on time, they always drop him off at the club on time, everything is good. This is a highly reliable environment. The child knows what to expect. See, household B now, however. This child is a far less reliable household. The father, when he comes home, if he, most of the time he is pretty happy still, so he hugs the child's happy. However, some of the time he's tired from the day at work, so he's very emotionally withdrawn and despondent, and just walks past the child and goes on, his day, and the child's left very disappointed. And this kind of comes and goes in waves. In addition, kid goes to the same soccer club because they're in the same neighborhood as kid A, so they wait after school. And most of the time the mom is on time and still picks up the kid. However, sometimes because her work has changing schedules, she's very late to pick up her child, and she gets into the soccer club when it's mostly done. The kid misses most of the soccer experience, and he's left very disappointed. This child is going to have to constantly learn that this house is not a reliable place. Sometimes he can expect comfort from his father, sometimes he can expect his mother to take him to the soccer club, but then he also has to learn when there might be weeks when his mom isn't going to pick him up to the soccer club on time, and maybe he shouldn't expect her to, and then he should also learn to expect that his dad isn't going to hug him some weeks just because of their hard work. So he has to constantly be updating versus the reliable household. So how does this play out in the literature? So in this literature, I'm going to go run through the tasks that we used. So again, this has also been previously used in general population samples, and they found that there are small differences between high AQ and low AQ, so high trait individuals and low trait individuals, in their performance on this, such that when individuals are put into a highly unreliable environment, so the cues in the environment they're using are constantly changing, these individuals struggle a lot more to learn from these contingencies than low trait individuals. Now, the way we did that with this task was, first we brought in, again, they filled out a series of questionnaires looking at personality traits and the AQ, and then they are put in here and they are instructed that they want to get as many points as possible from this test. Everyone loves getting high points. This is actually a pretty easy way to get participants involved. It's exciting. So they are instructed that they are to learn as quickly as possible which card is correct the most often, and when they select the correct card, they will receive all the points on that card. So if this card is correct and they pick it, they'll receive 28. If this card is correct, they pick it, it'll be 35. However, if they pick the incorrect card, they get none. So they want to learn as quickly as possible the valuable card, the card that's correct most often. They're given no real information about the image that's in the center of the screen. For the sake of these trials, I will be showing you a face, but there's also a different condition where there's arrow. Participants experience both conditions. It was randomized which one they experienced first. So then what happens is, unbeknownst to the participant, there are stages to this experiment. In the first stage, everything starts off reliable. The cards, let's say, in this case, let's say the blue card is the reliably more correct most often. But in addition, we also have the face in the center. And the face in each trial will look towards one of the cards. Now, let's say this face starts off reliably pointing to the correct card. So you can also learn from the face that the face is pointing to the correct card most of the time. And that's kind of that first phase. Everything's reliable, the contingencies don't really change. Once you've learned it, you're pretty much getting all the points. However, things change in the second phase to an unreliable and volatile period, where these contingencies, so blue always being right or maybe face pointing toward the card, is constantly swapping. So every several trials, it will change between maybe faces reliably pointing to the correct card to faces now reliably pointing to the incorrect card. Or it was the blue card that was mostly correct, now it's the red card that's mostly correct. And these contingencies change back and forth over a shorter period of time. So now these individuals, participants, are having to quickly learn as fast as possible which is the correct one to get as many points as possible. And this is a very confusing period. This is quite challenging for participants. After this phase is complete, it moves on to a third phase where everything reverts back to a reliable period once again. And whatever it's all randomized, so the reliable contingency they end up on might not be what they started on, but let's say it ends with the red card being the correct the most often and the face always pointing to the wrong card, for example. And once you learn those, they don't change, and that's for many trials, and then the experiment concludes. So this is kind of an example of what it is. Sit down, here's what a trial would look like. Looks the blue, okay. So I get a chance to choose. I then make my selection. The card is framed to let me know which selection I made, and I receive feedback. So, okay, great. And then, okay, so but unbeknownst to me, let's say a bunch of trials have gone by, it's now changed. So I learned that the face was reliably pointing towards the blue card. That was mostly correct. So okay, face points towards the red card. Well, the face is normally pointing towards the correct card, so I should go with the red card. I choose the red card this time. No, it's wrong. The face has deceived me. And then I have to learn to update essentially what I know about this. And you have to do that multiple times throughout the experiment. And the quicker you update your model, the more you're going to get correct, so the higher score you're going to. And here's just the trial overall. We have one with the faces, and then one with non-social feedback, just an arrow. And in the feedback for non-social stimulus, the feedback itself doesn't change in this case. We're not looking at feedback this time, just the stimulus and the environment. And what do we get? Okay, so in the low traits group, we get this exactly as we expected. In the first 30 trials, this is the reliable phase. They do pretty decently. And the unreliable trials, you're getting pretty close to that 50% chance random performance. And then when they go back to reliable, they once again increase their performance. Exactly as expected. Now, we move on to the high AQ groups. Okay, they performed identical, once again, to the low AQ groups. This is interesting because at this point, we've now looked at both sides of the puzzle, the unreliable feedback or unreliable environment, and we're seeing to see consistent behavioral differences between individuals who are high on these traits and low on these traits. Okay, so that's a bit unusual. This is honestly not what I expected going into this, to be fair. I didn't spend all these years being like, this is my plan. There's pretty good literature out there and pretty good reason to expect to see differences However, in these groups, we didn't. Now, kind of discussion about both these samples. So essentially this idea of just looking at unreliable feedback or environment overall. So we don't find any differences in anything across the board in any condition. So that's a little bit interesting. And this doesn't really suggest that this is a learning disorder, at least with regards to reliable, unreliable feedback and reward sensitivity. In addition, if any of you are familiar with Bayesian analysis, we wanted to see the degree to which our data supported the null hypothesis. So essentially, what was the chance that this was legitimately nothing? And we got strong Bayesian support for nothing. So it's not that this was random chance. We have several factors of support for it. So strong support for the null, in case anybody out there is Bayesian, like I'm trying to learn to be. And then we do have a few different possible ideas. It is possible that these differences in these groups only come out at the extreme ends. So maybe even though we had AQ groups that were larger, like the differences between the high and low AQ was larger than that reported in general literature, we try to get as intense groups difference as possible. It's possible that we need even a more extreme group. So what we did was this is not something we've ever published, but we kind of wanted to see what happens if we try to mimic what normal literature out there looks like. So really small sample sizes, and looking at only the most extreme groups. So we took people who were scoring like 30 and higher on the AQ, and if you're familiar with kind of the validation literature behind the autism spectrum quotient that we use, individuals who have a 32 or higher score have an 80% chance of being diagnosed with ASDs. So this is a pretty reliable, these people are performing much like their clinical group. So we took 10 of them and we took 10 extremely low AQ individuals, almost all single digit scores. And we ran this again to see if we could pull out any sort of result. We found essentially the same thing. No differences between the high and low groups, even when taking extreme groups of participants. And it is possible that it's not this probabilistic learning mechanism, it's not this reliable, unreliable learning mechanism underpinning this. So it could be a different learning mechanism, but it's not one we've seen. In addition, there are at this point, I will just openly say this would be serious design flaws with making conclusions based off of extremely small sample sizes was fine like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's not so much with kind of social psychology and psychology in general, with the changing angle of the literature. That's nowhere near as acceptable anymore. Studies have to be much larger and appropriately powered nowadays. So we were using modern day standards for running these studies. Just to give you an idea, like the sample sizes for the previous task, the one I just showed, we had about 200 people in this one, and the one looking at reliable and unreliable feedback, the probabilistic selection task, we had just under 500 people in that sample size. So if there's anything to be found, we would have found them in a sample size that large. In addition, again, as I mentioned before, in the reward sensitivity literature, this is consistent in the probabilistic literature, the reliable, unreliable feedback environment literature. They're never blind to their studies. They know exactly what's going on. We were blind to all our conditions. And then finally, there is this idea of what is social feedback. We're kind of seeing if there's a difference between social and non-social. What studies defined as social and non-social feedback varies greatly. Again, I can kind of get more into it, but like legitimately studies will say things are social that are like something as simple as somebody just looking at a glowing object and saying that's social versus just the glowing object being non-social. It's just the person being there making it social. Literally one hand being non-social, two hands being social. A lot of studies use emojis as social feedback. And then, some studies use actual faces, but that's why we chose a face from the experimenter. We try to get a face that not only is a human face, but also a face that you have met before, so it should have some value for you. And again, not what I was expecting. If you have any other questions, let me know, but take-home messages. There are subtle behavioral differences between these two groups in the general population, so there actually is something going on here. They do behave differently in some subtle way. Now, what's causing those subtle behavioral differences? Unfortunately, we've spent now several years trying to find the learning mechanism behind it, but it doesn't appear to be any of these that we've investigated. Some of our future directions, we're actually looking at some local processing theories. So this idea that actually it's a performance increase in individuals who just have higher traits, report higher traits of autism spectrum disorders. Individuals who are clinically diagnosed and those who report more traits, they actually perform better in local processing tasks, so looking at the fine details. And we're looking into if that might be responsible, this enhancement of the local details, but deficits on the global details, that might affect or be associated with differences between these two groups. And if that replicates in a large sample, and that can be associated with social behavior. So that's kind of where we're going, because this is honestly turning up very late. And that's my message today. If you have any questions, let me know.
Sounds very interesting. Questions, comments?
There's two things I associate with Baron Cohen. One is his brother, who
Yes.
does crazy things in the movies. The second is the theory of the mind.
Yes. Yeah.
And where does your research fit into the theory of the mind?
So,
Okay, because theory of the mind talks about the fact that autistic individuals have difficulty in sizing up social interactions. And that leads then to cognitive difficulties and learning difficulties.
Mhm.
So where does your research fit into the theory of the mind?
okay. So I guess this is a little bit of a preference. There are a lot of theories of, I mean, it's kind of one of those things you can throw a dart at a board and you hit a different theory. And they are all kind of competing, if you will, for trying to explain what the effects are. So theory of mind often is quite associated with executive function and like working memory, so on and so forth. And there's been mixed literature on that, and with some finding that there are differences, some not finding there are differences. Simon Baron-Cohen himself also really dives into the extreme male brain theory and the social brain theory. And this look is a bit more, so the theory of the mind work looks at, I guess you could almost call them different mechanisms. So there is also this idea that there isn't one type of autism. It is not like the ASD as a disorder is not a single cause. And there might be multiple causes for this. And actually, that's kind of why it's possible for both of these things to be correct. Though to be fair, since my literature is not actually finding anything here, maybe he is more correct. I mean, like we looked on this learning mechanism angle and we're not finding anything. So if anything, I mean, if I were him, I would use this as support. He might, you know, that his theory is probably more correct, if you know what I mean. Like, we're unable to find any differences between these groups. It's, how do I put this? It's just very messy because there's a lot of, literature actually is very mixed in most findings. So even though the common theory is actually theory of mind, there's a bunch of studies out there that actually don't find differences in theory of mind between clinical and non-clinical groups. If you look really closely, it's basically a war about who's right and who's wrong, because pretty much I can, almost any theory I can present to you, I can show you literature that finds support for the theory. I can also find you literature that totally debunks that theory, which is why we really need to clean up our act when it comes to running these studies, because there's a lot of concerning problems with them, a lot of issues with the methodologies.
Doesn't that go back to the other John Ioannidis or something like that? He was talking about how a huge chunk of psychology is not replicable.
Yes. I can go off. I mean, if I had another hour, I could go off an entire another
I
story.
think there's so many issues, right? So how you, like, even when you said, you know, you think that a person you just met, their face is perhaps a more social thing, but that's an assumption, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, again, like this might be. So I guess there's a bunch of areas that actually need to be expanded upon this. It's not only we're noticing these behavioral differences, but what exactly are the behavioral differences? We actually have video recordings of these, and that's what we're trying to break down. So, like I can. Again, this is a little anecdotal because it's such a small sample size of the data I broke down. But when you record second by second, frame by frame on these individuals, people who report people who report higher traits or report higher on the AQ, they are way less interactive than individuals who report lower. So if you're like kind of a very low AQ individual, you're usually pretty animatronic. You'll laugh, you make jokes. Some of the individuals who are on the higher scale, they legitimately sound like this. They're like, I go to London. I had a great time. This was quite funny. ha 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 ha, and like very stifled and were very reserved. Again, we need to fully process all the videotapes, but that's kind of part of the thing we want to look at is how does frame by frame differences look? Where are these behavioral differences coming from? So
But
to get
even
more-
within the group, so do you have IQ measures on these people?
So we have systematizing quotient, so SQ scores and EQ scores. We're using a general population, so it's kind of one of those things that like when you're gathering from a general population, most of their IQ, most of them are university students, more highly educated individuals.
Right, so maybe that's the difficulty though in university students, that you're getting people who are higher intelligence to begin with.
Yeah.
And so maybe they are, and presumably higher intelligence means learning faster across the board.
Yes.
And so if you took a broader sample of IQs, and maybe other studies did, maybe they didn't, but then would you find differences if you took a group of people with IQs from 70 to 90?
Excellent question. And that opens up another Pandora's
Yeah,
box.
well, yeah, I think that's
Actually,
because there's so many different things that go into it.
yes, and it also depends on, so I can tell you actually a little bit about that, not directly related to my research, but there's also some studies that found that, for example, differences in executive functioning, so there's some theories out there that like these executive functioning differences between people who are clinical and non-clinical groups, and they said, well, some of these are actually just controlled by verbal IQ scores, and they're like, it's not actually a difference per se, it's your scores, not just on IQ in general, but specifically verbal IQ scores that affect these executive functioning processes. So in some of the differences between these groups, it actually legitimately is unique facets of IQ. But these were not general populations, these were findings from clinical and non-clinical. And that's probably the reason why they looked at IQ very specifically, was because of that. In addition, just one of the things is, I guess from a methodological standpoint, there are not great IQ scores that you can run on a computer quickly with participants. That has to do with mostly nobody's bothered to take up the mantle and make a great IQ test for these individuals. Most of the best ones are all hand done, and the ones that are on computers do not have great validity or reliability. I have a few colleagues who work in essentially scale validity work, and like how good is a scale, would they recommend scales to me? And when I went to them for help about that, they're basically being like, do not use any of the current stuff out there with IQ scores on computers because it's like not great. You will find people are all over the place when that's not actually their scores. So I was actually recommended not to do that from some people in that area. It's, again, kind of going back to your previous point about psychology has a lot of issues currently going on with that. And that's kind of why our studies were trying to control for everything we had in our power to do. We're trying to get very high-powered studies and try to be double-blind, because currently those are some of the real big issues that have resulted in non-replication. I mean, the priming literature is failing to replicate at a higher than 50% ratio because the not double blinding will essentially drive all your timing effects. So, I mean, I agree with a lot of the concerns. I
think that's just the nature of the beast in a sense. I mean, you
yes.
can't, even if you have a large sample size, it still doesn't, if you have two studies of equal sample size, it doesn't mean the two populations with two samples are
Yes.
equal to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something you really can't control for.
Yeah.
The other thing I wonder a little bit about is, first of all, with the autism question, so the fact, autism is a syndrome where you have these unrelated symptoms. You have the social communication piece, but also the repetitive behavior piece. Part.
Yes.
And I think everything that you're looking at is, and what the AQ measures is the social communication piece, it would seem, and not so much the repetitive behavior part of things.
So, I mean, where there are also, kind of going way back to the beginning, there are like that, the attention switching and attention to detail. So, I like to collect stamps. That's not exactly social in nature. But as far as it goes to just literally headbanging stuff, that's why we're looking
but even with collecting stamps, there are people who collect stamps, and then there are people who spend every hour talking about stamps and looking at stamps and reading, and that's a qualitative difference. I don't know how you actually measure that in any kind of way.
Yeah, that's just some of the limitations of the scale being used. But it's also typically when looking at higher functioning individuals, ones that are just, that would be clinical. But when looking at non-clinical groups, we're just looking kind of if they display more of these traits. So they're not clinical in nature, they just might be very similar in several facets.
So if you go back 2 slides. One forward. It's not supported findings suggesting that autism is a learning disorder. But if we're talking about non-clinical populations, can you actually make that conclusion?
Well, so again, a lot of the research that we were basing this off of, we tried to look at studies and tasks that were done both in clinical and non-clinical groups. So if the clinical and non-clinical both find it, then it should be reasonable that we should have found it also. So, for example, if the study was done in a clinical group and the study was done using the AQ in a general population sample, that previous study had found a difference. But again, that study had several of the studies had serious concerns. And so we correct for that. And when we corrected for that, we no longer found these differences.
So but if that's what was directing your research, if that's what your research was based on, though, then or if there, I mean, then maybe that's not the right.
Oh, of course. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that. Like, that's kind of what I'm saying. If this might not actually be a thing, because if that literature is essentially being made on findings from sample size of 10 people per group, then we can't really suggest that that's a thing. I mean, I would also strongly recommend, because remember, there's also lab biases. I mean, we're not talking about, besides person bias and experimenter bias, there's lab biases. So I would strongly recommend another group to replicate these in a large sample like I did, and just to make sure that, again, it isn't something about folks at London and Western, like just this pocket of Canada causing these results. So yeah, I wouldn't, from what I'm concluding, this is what I would say, but I would really like it if a different person, because I don't, it's lab differences, I wouldn't want to replicate it myself because of the implications of that. But if another lab somewhere else, maybe in a different part of America, replicated this, like took this on as a challenge and got another large group and still found nothing, then I think that would kind of be a nail in the coffin for these kind of ideas. Not that there's not another learning mechanism responsible, not that there's not some sort of global processing concern, but just specifically when it comes to reliable and unreliable feedback, this is unlikely to be.
But the question. So we recognize people with autism have social difficulties, but I think the question you're asking, it's foremost, is what is the basis of social?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's the same with eye contact. So there's some people who believe that autism is associated with gaze aversion.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, do you think people with autism avert their gaze, or they just don't know what they guys? I don't actually think the gaze aversion hypothesis is correct.
Oh, again, there's another.
But there's like so we can say, okay, maybe learning isn't the issue. So there's a woman named Geraldine Dawson who's at the University of Washington. She was the head of Autism Speaks, but her hypothesis, she's a psychologist, was that neonates, I think we know human babies they preferentially look at human faces from a very, very young age. And her hypothesis is that the children who later develop autism don't have that preference from time of birth. But if they don't have that preference, then they're not going to be looking at faces, and so they're not going to get that input. And so their brain is not going to be developing in the same way as other people.
That's a bit of an offshoot from the social motivation hypothesis for autism, isn't it? Like they're not motivated to seek out those.
I suppose, but if it's a neurological thing, motivation seems like the wrong word. It is the right idea, but it's motivation somehow seems like a intentional kind of thing.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, but I think that's semantics.
Yeah, exactly. But again, I'm not really disagreeing with all that. It's that there's just, again, kind of going back, there's so much out there, and there's, because that very well could be the correct theory. Obviously needs more replicating, needs more expanding upon. I'm just kind of saying, I think my stuff that I've spent years on is probably not. Like, I ran the gauntlet and I came up short. So,
but I think it's important regardless, because first of all, negative studies don't get published, and secondly, I think that to say, okay, what is the explanation? Here's our possible explanations. Can we check them off one at a time?
Yes, and I 100% agree. I think that's what this is most useful for. Honestly, saying if we have, with constant funding cuts and everything, we only have so many resources we can work with. I'm basically suggesting you might not want to spend tons and tons and tons of extra resources on this area. You might want to spend it more on, early neurological development for face preferences. Or maybe you want to look at, Western also has a division that looks at the biological implications of gut flora and fauna and how that affects ASD symptoms.
They looked at calorie load.
Okay. Well, yeah. Either way, whether you agree with that or not, that's another theory that's out there to be tested. Then there's this literature.
So what was that?
We heard him say about gut flora and autism. So just the one who could be Western.
No, it's different fame. He was funded largely by Dave Patch-11, like this at $5-6 million. And I don't know all the ins and outs of the program of psychology, but I think with the new chair, Derek was invited to move elsewhere. And so he's at the University of Calgary. So,
Calgary?
Yeah.
And so there's all that going on. And also with the idea that there's multiple forms of this. So there's actually some interesting generalization literature that finds that people who are clinically diagnosed, there's actually subgroups to them. So some of them are typical generalizers and some of them are atypical generalizers. And that actually does kind of build this idea that like we're diagnosing these people with being like, you have an ASD, autism spectrum disorder, but that's probably not the right thing. We should likely, there's probably, you have ASDs type A, you have ASD type B, you have ASD type C. There's probably a bunch of subcategories to this where these people have certain skills intact and certain ones impaired.
The difficulty with that, so people have tried doing that with factor analysis and stuff, and it
Oh.
never gets replicated. It's
Oh, no.
always a different group of symptoms that come
Yes.
together. and I think
Yeah.
that's the problem.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, again, I'm making that suggestion about this.
No, I think you're right. But I think the problem is that our ability, at least in medicine, to measure behavior is terrible.
Yes.
And so even though we say, that we don't get the factor, the clusters don't come out consistently, but that's because different people are measuring. And no
Yes,
matter
exactly.
how reliable a scale is,
Yeah.
it's not going to be perfectly reliable.
Yes.
And I think that creates all kinds of difficulties.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Like that's like, I mean, some of it's just legitimately, we have spent so many decades with these kind of okay enough, good enough mentality of like, this scale's good enough, this is good enough, we tried good enough, our sample size is good enough, that we have a lot of literature that isn't replicating or is constantly giving mixed findings. And that has definitely hurt us moving forward. I think there definitely should be a big push to, re-go over this and replicate things so we can really start, as you said, checking off the theories. This one replicates 10% of the time. This one replicates 80% of the time. Okay, that's a strong one. Let's further look into that one. This one replicates 70%. Let's look into that one. Let's not keep looking at, like there's like 10 to 20 current theories out there about it. Maybe we should check off some of the ones that really aren't holding water anymore.
But also look and see how those things are related to each other, because it's obviously not one or the other.
Oh, no.
And we look for pure measures, but there probably isn't any. And it'd be nice to so when you talk about how executive functioning relates to theory of mind, so how do we put those two things together as one theory? It'd be nice to be able to do.
Could you just repeat where the population came from? Was it this group that were playing games?
Oh, no. Like that was just some of my acquaintances. Most of the population. So for the reward sensitivity task and the unreliable feedback task, as well as the social interaction, they came from both like Western students in general, so everyone from undergraduates to PhDs, as well as the
clinical.
Yeah.
Even though it was high on the scale,
Yeah.
there were still non-clinical.
And I think a lot of people are moving towards doing that because it's easier to do research. Clinical populations, by definition, are not going to be all that common, but also, I think one of the difficulties with a lot of autism research, you can't do this kind of stuff in people who are classically autistic, just because of cognitive factors and all sorts of things. Because then the issue is who's the control group and a number of other
So
issues.
high ASK was in a non-clinical.
Yes,
population.
yep.
Okay.
But I think a number of groups, I think Ryan Stevenson does the exact same thing.
Yes, yeah.
Ryan is working with some similar things,
Sure.
and sort of other people. But the issue that I have, I don't know if that necessarily translates into autism. So are those generalizable? And I think that's something that needs to be replicated. So once you have a consistent finding with these high AQ groups, do you find the same things in people with actually classic autism?
Well, that'll be the next question.
Absolutely,
Why don't you
yeah.
finish first? I mean, kind of funny you mentioned Ryan Stevenson. When I was talking about the feedback, the unreliable, reliable feedback study, he had something similar, like similar concept, but specifically with like sensory processing. And he's basically being like, yeah, the literature says it's there, but when we try it in our labs, we're not getting anything either.
I think he also, because when you talk about probabilistic learning mechanisms, I think he's done some stuff where it's into statistical learning and language development.
Yes,
But I can't remember what they found exactly, so I can't really.
Yeah, and
So
I actually
something
was
about
talking to them when they were first running it. I never got the results from them, but I was talking to them when they were first kind of going through the ethics application and collecting that first batch.
That's right.
Yeah, no, I mean, did you guys have any comments or questions?
Oh, it was very interesting. Our end here, trying to understand what the difference was in the groups in control versus the benefit. And how do you get to that conclusion?
Which one?
The one about autism non-learners.
But I think you're talking about the social difficulties.
Yes,
Yeah, right? Yes.
Right?
Not
Yes.
that.
Yes.
Right, not,
But
not
it-
like we think of it.
No,
No,
But I still think that like social environment is such, it's so much more complex than what you can replicate in the lab.
Yeah, but essentially what it is there's like, essentially if you strip things down, we have base mechanisms. When it comes down to it, you can strip most people down to base cognitive mechanisms more or less. I mean, if you want to go real simplistic, fundamentalist mentality, But if we're not seeing any differences between these groups in any of these cognitive performances, and when I mean these, I mean learning disorder, I mean specifically these ones when it comes to reward sensitivity and reliable, unreliable feedback. There is I'm specifically talking about these types of learning mechanisms. There's just such a wide variety. Again, we're talking about global processing mechanisms. Are we talking about, executive function? Are we talking about, theory of mind? Like, there's so many cognitive mechanisms that need to be tested out and further expanded upon. I'm just saying these specific ones probably aren't, maybe replicate once more just to make sure there's nothing there. But once that's done, don't spend your time and money. Yeah.
No, but what would be, I think would be really interesting if I don't know if it's even possible though, because our environments aren't random. We choose our environments a little. So the kid who is one who doesn't do well socially, if they're not interacting as much with other people, they're not getting the same feedback from the social environment as other people, and so they're not learning in the same way. And so there's ways, if there were measures, that you could look at kids who are 1 and 3 and 5 and 7, just at the same people to see how those things, so does that gap actually potentially widen over time, which you might expect if they're not involved in the same social environment.
I think these are definitely all things that, like, in the future of research, kind of going from a more, like, I guess, methodologically sound perspective. Yeah. These are things that should be implemented and strictly controlled to really pull out these findings. Is there something there or not? But something like that would be a methodological longitudinal study.
Yeah, but you don't want a good theory before you went into it, and that's where this kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. This stuff is ideally pointing to ideas that work or don't work. In my case, don't work. But yes, once you had some strong fundamental foundations, like stuff that constantly replicated, then yes, you would want to really dive into looking at these developmental trajectories. Fortunately and unfortunately, I suppose we can, kind of remove some stuff from the long list. But we do need to start limiting our list. We can't keep running with like 20, 30 theories.
No, but so Daniel, and sorry, he did his PhD with Annette. Do you know what Daniel?
Yeah.
And sorry, in math stuff actually.
Daniel.
At Western.
Talking about a conference.
Yes, but he did his PhD with Annette Carvalho-Smith. We did her PhD with Jean Piaget, which isn't a bad lineage, I suppose. But her whole thing is that we call these things developmental disorders, but so often we look at things in cross section, and really we need to look at them developmentally over time. But I suppose we have to have a framework in which to look at them.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Definitely. I guess the problem with development or longitudinal studies is just that you kind of go from the more like funding perspective, and also it's hard to get people to jump into those.
So I don't think it's hard to get clinical populations to come back because it's the controls. It's almost impossible to get them to come back at times B, C, and D, and that makes it really difficult. Anyway, this was fantastic. I really appreciate that. Thank you.